Turn myself on there. Good evening. As you might notice, I'm not Miles. So we'll start out, any prayer concerns? Okay. Going once, going twice. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pray. Our Father God, we come to you now and thank you for today. We thank you for the many blessings that we have in our lives. Father, I just lift up those that have lost loved ones, that indeed need your peace and your comfort to get through the times when they may not think they can get through. But we know, Father, that you're faithful if we are faithful with you. Father, I just ask now that we have this time of Bible study, that you will open our hearts and our minds and give me the words to speak, that your word would be clearly understood, and that we might be able to take it from here to enrich our lives. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, I say that to start out with a disclaimer. At this moment, please lower your expectations and you won't be disappointed. And the other is the opinions expressed by me may not necessarily represent those of Crossroads, but they probably do. But anyway, it's me. So we're in 1 Samuel 17. Your headings might note that this is the David and Goliath episode. We have 58 verses to get through tonight, so if I took a minute a verse, we'd have 2 minutes left over, but we'll see how that goes. I broke it down into what I consider, at least for the instance of teaching it, is kind of five sections. So you'll know when we're getting near the end when I get to number 4. So you'll know what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and the first section I'm calling is the location of the story. And this is the first through the third verses. It says, and I'm using NIV from 1984. So if you have a newer NIV, you may hear some different words, but I'm using this one because the words are big and I can see to read, I think. All right. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Succoth in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes Dammim and between Succoth and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites the other, and there was a valley between them. So to start out with, I think at least when I read the Bible and we get these stories and they give all these names of these places, I like to find out what's going on, where these are at. So if you're old school and have a Bible with a map in the back, you can look at that right now. There are several places mentioned. What I want to talk about basically in this part is the city of Azekah, the valley of Elon, and the Shephelah, which is not mentioned there, but I'll get to that, how that comes into effect. Okay, so first we have Azekah, which is a city that is kind of overlooking this valley of Elah. Now, if you look at it, in order to get to Bethlehem or Jerusalem up in the mountains, you have to go through this valley to get there. And so this Azekah was an important city because it kind of guarded this section. So there was a lot of fighting in this area. History tells us that, if you remember Nebuchadnezzar, he came through here and wiped out the city. Sennacherib, the Assyrian, he also went through this area on their way to take over Jerusalem. They, laid waste to this city as well. So this was an important city in order to keep the hill country protected. From Azekah, you can see the Mediterranean Sea, which is about 12 miles to the west. It's located in the Shephelah, which, if you're not sure what the Shephelah is, as you're looking on your map, you'll see next to the Mediterranean, they have an area, what's called the coastal plains. The Shephelah is the area between there and the mountains. The Shephelah means lowlands or foothills. And the reason the Shephelah is important is because that's where the main trade routes went through. So the country that controlled this area basically influenced culture all over the world, because you had people coming up from Egypt going over to the Persian area, which wasn't Persia at that time, but up towards Babylonia in that area. So they had to pass through here on their way. So if you controlled those cities that were along this territory, then you basically influenced culture. And another note here to let you know that some of these ideas are not my own. I'm a big fan of Ray Vander Laan. So some of the stuff you'll be hearing is basically Ray Vander Laan from Focus on the Family's program. So I won't take credit for any wise thing I might say. It's probably his words, not mine. But so again, the influence of culture, the main trade routes. And the problem here is that the Israelites were asked or told by God that they could, take over this if they'd run the people out. They could control the Shephelah area, which they didn't. They chose to go back up and live mostly up in the mountains, the Judea mountains. Now, from time to time, you'll see where they did control this area, but that's later on in like Solomon and David's, when he's actually king, that they do this. So the main point I wanted to get you of the reason for the Shephelah is just the importance of that area was, and the fact that whoever controlled it controlled the culture and what went on. In your Bible, the city of Succoth might be spelled Shocheh. It's the same place. We then move into the second area, which is verses 4 through 11. I call this the introduction to Goliath. And we read in verse 4, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall, and he had a bronze helmet on his head. He wore a coat of scale armor of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel, and give a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and the other Israelites were dismayed and terrified. And we say to that, duh, because here you have a 9-foot-tall guy out there shouting at you to come down and fight. Now, this idea of one person fighting for each side and controlling the whole side is not unfamiliar in these times. It was called champion warfare. So you sent out your best guy, they sent out their best guy, and then you basically said if whoever won, the other side would, give in to them. So as we picture Goliath here, it says he was 9 feet tall in the NIV, which is 6 cubits, if you're into cubits. He's 6 cubits. He also is noted there as having a bronze armor weighing 5,000 shekels. Some versions will say 6,000. And then he has armor that is 125 pounds. So you can imagine you got to be a pretty stout guy to carry around 125 pounds all the time. You'll note a couple places where it said he stood. Well, a lot of times these guys would come out and set a chair down or a stool or whatever, and they'd sit there and wait for somebody to come. So if you note in there that it says Goliath stood, well, he came out from a sitting position, because if you're carrying that much metal around, sitting there for as long as they did, it would wear on you. So he's yelling at them, trying to goad them into a fight, but not just goading. Here we have a man who is basically yelling at God, because if he's bad-mouthing Israel, he's bad-mouthing God. So the Hebrew writers that I found in some of the study I did is the way they picture Goliath is a representation of evil. If you'll notice throughout the description, the number 6 is used. And 6 is, if you get into the 666 stuff with the Antichrist, it's just another way to denote that Goliath basically represented, the evil parts of the world. An evil that resented God, an evil that, talks, back to God. And if you notice how the breastplate is mentioned, it's called a scale of armor. So it kind of look like fish scales. Hebrew writers kind of likened that to the serpent. So you have another depiction of evil in the serpent and the way Goliath looked. We mentioned his taunting God. And there in verse 11, notice that they were terrified, which, I'm sure all of us would be, looking down on this giant guy. Any questions so far? Are we pretty keeping up with me here? All right. Because I'm going really fast. I don't know if I'm talking really fast or... Because we're already at part 3. Okay. So I'll slow down here because this is a bigger part. This is David comes to the battle. Now David, the son of an Ephraite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was old and well advanced in years. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Elah, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of the unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines." Early in the morning, David left the flock with a shepherd, loaded up, and set out, as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines and facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and ran to the battle lines and greeted his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath the Philistine, champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. And when the Israelites saw the man, they ran from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give his daughter in marriage and will exempt him from father's family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." And when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking, he burned with anger at him, asking, "Why have you come down here, and with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is, and you came down only to watch the battle." So I have a picture here then of each morning and evening, Goliath comes out, yells his usual taunting. We have a picture of both the lines coming onto either side of the valley, lining up alongside, on the sides of the cliffs there. And he can still scare them, and they're up on top of this cliff. Both sides were, fairly difficult to get up from what I read. So it's not like they could just, hot-footed across there and, climb up and get them really easy without too much trouble. I find it interesting that he comes out in the morning and evening, so Goliath's not really an idiot. He knows that that's the coolest time of the day, so if you're weighing 125 pounds of armor and you got to sit there and shout at people, probably the best time to do it would be in the morning and the evening. And when Jesse asked him to take an ephah, in case you're not up on Hebrew levels of measure, that's about a bushel. So he's taking him about a bushel of roasted grain to his brothers. Let's see. And another thing I found kind of interesting is that there in verse 20, it says, as he reached the camp of the army, it was going out to the battle position, shouting out the war cry. Now, I don't know, I find that humorous that here they are shouting a war cry, and as soon as this guy comes out, they're terrified, and, so I'm not sure how effective their war cry was. Evidently, it didn't bother Goliath very much as he continued to come out. Another thing I'll give Goliath is that he was, there for 40 days, so he was committed. I'll give him that. He was committed to what was going on. Again, here you see the number 40 used, as you'll see many times throughout the scripture, days. And so as we got to the 40th day here, we'll see coming up what's going to happen to these two people. So they give their war cry. Goliath there, the champion from Gath. If you look on your maps, you'll know that there's not a whole lot of difference there, or a whole lot of distance between Gath and this area. Goliath being the son of Anak, which was part of a large, I say a large family, I mean a tall family. Goliath had 4 other brothers that we'll touch on here in a little bit. And if you like conspiracy theories, there is some thought that they might have been descendants from the Nephilim. So I'll let you chew on that one if you so desire to look at that later on. So he comes out, the champion. And there again in verse 24 it says that they all ran from him in fear, so they evidently go back off their battle lines, and I kind of picture them kind of creeping, skulking back up to the edge of the valley there again after Goliath sits back down or goes back into probably under some shade. We also see that there's been a bounty put on Goliath's head, that being Saul's daughter and the family being exempt from taxes. How would we like that these days? You know, we'd like to be able to have, and of course, great wealth along with that. So, I'd like to gain a great wealth and not have it taxed. That would be nice. And here we see David, evidently the only guy of the bunch that, takes what Goliath has been saying to heart and how that looks to God, that they're allowing him to stand out there and, basically, thrust his fist up at heaven, and tell God what for. You might think of these days, Goliath is flipping the bird at God, and also the host of Israel. And then we see there in verse 28, Elob's, David's oldest brother, he burned with anger. And why do you think little David coming here kind of got under his skin? Especially when he knows that he thinks David is conceited. Okay, he might be embarrassed. Okay.
And being a sheep herder, he's not got the most prestigious profession.
But one that is good for what he's about to do. But I see him. Well, it says burn with anger, but I almost picture jealousy. That here's young David coming up, and if we remember, not too far removed. I'm not sure exactly how many years, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, what had happened to David. Okay, he's been anointed king. How'd you like to hold that over your brothers' heads? You picture back in the days when Joseph got his coat of many colors, he kind of held that over his brothers' heads, and they didn't take too kindly that to either. These guys, I'm sure, knew that story well, and I'm sure they maybe had the same kind of thoughts for their little brother David that, one day you're going to be bowing down to me. He might have said once or twice at the supper table, pass me the roasted grain, servant, kind of needling them a little bit. Okay. So we go into the next section, which I've entitled Prepared for Battle. And it says, "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. The men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been fighting man from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock. I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from this hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put on his coat of armor and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on a sword over his tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in his pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in hand approached the Philistine. Okay. So I've kind of went through here and kind of tried to anticipate some questions that there might have been through these different sections. And the one that kind of pops out to me here is that, Saul tells him that he's only a boy. And depending on who you look at, it can be anywhere from an 8, 9, or 10-year-old little boy upwards of, 15, 16. The ones that I look at that I have chosen to believe because God could do it with an 8 or 10-year-old boy, but the word boy here in Hebrew is an adolescent. So we're talking probably more like a 16 to 19-year-old young man. We know that because, one, he's not fighting with the army, and you had to be 20 years old to fight in the army. So we know that he's not 20 yet. And just to be able to do the things that he did and will be doing upcoming, I can see more of a young teenage boy being able to probably handle that a little better than a 9 or 10-year-old. And if you think about it, he's had time to have God work in his life through these different experiences. When was the last time you took on a lion or a bear? I mean, you give David credit to go after. Some of us might have said, "Take the sheep. I've got more over here, and we'll make more next year." I don't need it that bad, but that wasn't his way. His way was to protect his sheep. He took his shepherding duties very, very seriously. And we look through there and we see that that section through 34 through 37 is that where David's talking to Saul, convincing him. And between you and me, David had to be some kind of car salesman to get, the king to let him go fight for the whole country. There had to be something in David's appearance or the Holy Spirit whispering into Saul's head, this is the man to do the job. We're not told that, so again, these are my opinions expressed by me. Take them for what they're worth, and they won't get you a cup of coffee. But anyway, I just think there had to be something going on in this incident that allowed him to say, I killed a bear, I killed a lion, I can do the same thing to this uncircumcised Philistine. And I guess I just see David maybe glowing as he's talking about this, that there's something in his presence that, Saul can maybe sense that the Spirit of God is on him now, because Saul knows that he's not on him anymore.
What about the fact that Saul knew that David had been anointed to be king?
Mhm.
Sending him out there to be eliminated?
Yep, that's another possibility too, that it had got back to him and he was trying to. Did you have something, Rich? Oh, okay. So, that's a viable option too, that he was willing to, Saul had a plan B. Even if David got wiped out, we're still going to run back to the next spot and maybe defend it. And so.
You got to also remember that Jonathan and Saul were the only ones that had swords. The rest of them were fighting with tools, implements,
Exactly.
and he gave him his only sword.
Right. And the idea that there was only two, of course, this adds to why the Israelites might have been a little afraid, because across the valley they're seeing maybe the sun glint off all these shields and swords, and that might temper your resolve as to whether you want to run across the battlefield there and take them on. It is interesting that, as he said, the only two people that had any armor or swords at all were Jonathan and Saul. And that's because the Philistines held on to their iron technology pretty close to the best. They knew that they had the latest and greatest implement and metal, going. And, we're told elsewhere that, that if Israel wanted to have something like a plow shear or plow blade or, something like that sharpened, you had to go down to the Philistines and probably pay a pretty good penny to have that done for you. Just to give you a hint down the line, though, in the years, which I'm sure maybe Miles will get to this down the line, but David, in one of his getting away from Saul things, goes to and hides out with the Philistines, which I found that interesting as well, is that here the guy that, kind of subjugated your country for a while, now you're giving him refuge. Well, when he leaves that, there's some thought that he or somebody in his group got the iron technology and brought it back to Israel, and because you see soon after that Israel has iron technology. So that was free, that was extra. If you're ever on a trivia show, you can answer with confidence. All right, so. All right, and there in verse 38, we see that Saul tried to dress David in his stuff, and David he couldn't do it. It was uncomfortable probably for him. Even at a teenage boy, this stuff was probably heavy even for him. And you might as well have given him a stick as to give him a sword, because, how's he going to know even what to do with it, Yeah, and Saul's stuff was tall. So this just wasn't made for David. And I think we can also see, and I'll kind of use this section too as an application in a little bit, as to why this didn't work for him. Okay, so the next, the 5 stones. Actually, that was one of the questions that I asked myself. Okay. We have, the question says, why did David choose 5 smooth stones before going to fight Goliath? And This is a website called gotquestions.org. If you ever are looking for answers to something, this is a pretty good one. I like the way they write things, and I have found them to be pretty reliable. And but here's the answer they give. Some presume that David took the 5 smooth stones instead of just one because he had some doubt. Okay, so that's one theory. However, there's no indication in the story of David and Goliath that by picking up 5 smooth stones instead of one that David was doubting God. Rather, that David was simply being prepared what ifs the Philistines attacked him after he killed Goliath, how he would have defended himself. Of course, if there had been more than 4 other guys, he'd still be in trouble. And then I'm guessing, Tim, you're the last one that they have here. 4 brothers. So there's also the theory that David was picking out a stone for the other 4 guys. And that may well have been. It says, David had experience in defending the sheep he guarded with a sling and stones. It would seem that the animals David had faced were far braver than the men with Goliath, because they all turned and ran away. And we'll get to that here in a second. So, others speculate that David chose the 5 smooth stones because Goliath had 4 brothers, and David was readying himself to dispatch all 5 giants. There is a theory. This theory is based on 2 Samuel 21, verses 15 through 22. And that passage goes on to list the other 4 brothers of Goliath. That was 2 Samuel 21, 15 through 22. Says that passage lists 4 very large Philistines who were related to Goliath in some way. Okay. He's not here to correct me. One was Ishibi, Benanob, Saph, Goliath, and an unnamed giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. These 4 were born to a giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David or by the hand of his servants. The account of 1 Samuel 17 does not suggest that David knew about Goliath's brothers or that he believed that he would fight the whole family, but we know for sure that David and his men faced 4 other giants somehow related to Goliath in later battles. And I'm guessing he probably did. I'm sure that wasn't a real big secret to the people in that area that there were 5 big giants walking around causing trouble. All right. Now we come to section 5, so we're in the home stretch here. And this is verses 41 through 58. As soon as I tilt my head in the correct position. Okay, meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the fields." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me. I will strike you down and cut your head off. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those who gathered here will know that it is not by the sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him and took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the scabbard. After he'd killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapon in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, O king, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." As David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him to before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked him. David said, "I am the son of your servant Jesse in Bethlehem." All right. So there's several things to unpack in this section. First of all, it's not bragging if you can do it. So David had some pretty powerful words there for, a 9-foot giant that he was coming after. And even as the Philistine approached him, David was running at him. I give him big credit for that, because I'm not so sure that would be something that I could do. Another reason that I think he was probably an older guy than a 8 or 10-year-old. Through one of the things I read, they likened this ability to sling this stone as having the impact of a .45 revolver. So when it hit him in the head, it was basically going at the speed of what a .45 would do to a person. So that's some moving along there. And you can see why it brought him down, because it says it sunk in his head. I don't know if you tapped yourself right there real quick, but it doesn't budge a whole lot. So to have a stone hit you right there, that was going to leave a mark. So we see that, so he dropped, and then again, the ability to pick up Goliath's sword, that would take a little bit. I'm sure it wasn't any lightweight sword that he was picking up. So to be able to swing that over and take his head off with it, I think he was probably on the older end of that age range. Again, I'm not saying that God couldn't use a 10-year-old to chop a head off, but just...
His adrenaline would have been really pumped up.
Yep, he was in definite fight or flight mode there, and he was the fighter. All right, so the other thing is there. I think one of the key verses in this chapter here is there in verse 46, where it talks about that he will give the carcasses of the Philistine army and the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, that the whole world may know that there's a God in Israel. Ray Vanderlaan has made a whole website based on that term, because That the world may know is not only used here, there's other places that phrase is used, but still it's showing that God, using the right person, and the right person is the one that God chooses, and God using his innate abilities to strike a blow for Israel, where if Las Vegas had been laying odds on this battle, I'm sure it would have been very heavily weighted towards Goliath getting the points and the spread, you know. So that's the one verse I have underlined in this whole part here, is that the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. There's a few other things that I kind of want to explain here in the next couple minutes. Again, these are kind of questions that might have popped up in your head. One of them says that Saul didn't know who David was, or, you know, how could Saul not know who David was? We just know about him from the last chapter. You know, so he'd already been hired to play the lyre for him. Did I say that right? Play the lyre. Okay. The lyre being a instrument. Okay, just make sure you're not. He's not getting paid to tell fibs. So, you know, a couple things in study. They said that necessarily this isn't in chronological order, possibly. So it's possible this happened before that happened. But I'm more tended to think that. And let me find exactly where I'm looking for. I think the writer wrote it the way he wanted it, because if you look, as soon as I find it again, all right, verse 15. But David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep in Bethlehem. So probably on the days that he didn't have to go out and fight a battle, you know, we're only talking 10, 12 miles difference that this trip would have taken him. So, you know, it's not like a whole day's journey that he was having to go. Probably a young shepherd boy could probably do 10 miles. You know, you look at these marathoners today, they do 26 miles in a couple, 4 hours or less. So I'm sure he was in good condition. He could probably make that trip fairly easy. And that's one of the questions that I looked for under questions.org. It says, why does Saul ask who David is when he had met him earlier? It says, 1 Samuel relates the famous battle between David and Goliath. Young David had heard and seen the giant Philistines taunting, and David would volunteer. There are several possible explanations for why Saul asked about David in chapter 17 after he'd been introduced to him in chapter 16. As a preference, we should know that Saul was not inquiring of the identity of David per se in chapter 17. So note that. He's not asking David's name, he's asking David's father's name. One thing they say here, it's not unreasonable to think his name had slipped Saul's mind. Guilty here, I cannot throw stones. I have a hard time remembering people's names. So, you know, I can't blame Saul for forgetting who David's father was. Next was Saul needed to know the name of David's father in order to deliver the prize promised to the one who defeated Goliath. So here, you know, Jesse was going to get the tax-free stuff. So you want to make sure you're giving the right thing to the right person. So, you know, he's asking so that who got the tax exemption. which I'm sure Jesse was fine and dandy about. Another possible explanation is that, and I already mentioned that maybe not in chronological order. It says, in any event, the killing of Goliath proved that David was truly obedient servant of God who was concerned with the interests of his heavenly Father and his Father's people. Okay. A couple other things, just, I don't know if they caught your eye or not, but it says that David took his stuff back to his tent. Well, he wasn't there long enough to set up his own tent. So the thought from the scholars that I read is what they're talking about is his home in Bethlehem. So he scooted the armor and stuff he took with him from Goliath back to his house in Bethlehem. You'll also note later on that Goliath's sword is put in the tabernacle behind the ephod. So it's possible that the tent, one lesson writer said that possibly the intent was the tent being the tabernacle. Because they said how passionate David was about the tabernacle, it wouldn't be too far out of reason to say that was David's tent. So that's another possibility. He put it in the tabernacle as a consecrated thing to God. Because we see later on that he goes back and picks up that sword later on. Okay. There was one thing I came across that I found interesting, is that there was a question in here from the Got Questions thing I noticed. Who killed Goliath? David or Elhanan? Well, you say, well, I've never heard anybody else kill Goliath. Well, let me tell you. The record of Goliath's defeat at the hand of David is found in 1 Samuel 17. However, a verse in 2 Samuel seems to name Elhanan instead of David as the one who toppled Goliath. If you look into 2 Samuel 21:19, here's what's not so clear. In some translations, 2 Samuel 21:19 seems to indicate that it was Elhanan, not David, who killed the giant. And out of the ESV it says, and there was again a war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, son of a Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. The size of Goliath's shaft was a detail shared by both passages. The obvious difference here is who killed Goliath. Was it David or Elhanan? Well, to put your mind at rest, it was actually David. Because if you go to 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 5, the Hebrew wording there correctly tells us that it was the brother of Goliath that Elhanan killed. It was not Goliath. So, okay, and there are texts where the brother of is left out. There's a whole section of what I read about, maybe some Hebrew person back in the day forgot to put the brother of in there on that one verse, which later translators maybe found and corrected. I'm not going to mess with the Word of God. It's the way it is. So how that ever worked out, 1 Chronicles 25 kind of sets the table there as to who actually killed. So again, if you ever get into a discussion with somebody and they try to tell you, oh, the Bible's not correct, here it says one, here it says the other, you have the go-to verse to. That's true. He basically took out the whole Goliath family, in a sense. All right. Well, that went a little longer than I thought. I do want to wrap up with a little application, because it's fine to study the Bible and everything, but at some point you have to figure out, well, what does this mean to me? How can I take this out into the world tomorrow and use it? Well, a couple things I see, and again, feel free to disagree with me if you want. You'll be wrong, but you feel free to disagree with me. A couple of things, I mentioned earlier that David wasn't able to use Saul's armor to go out and fight Goliath because he wasn't used to it. The way I work that into today's application is that you've been gifted with your own abilities. You're not supposed to try to be Jeff. You're supposed to be Dolores. You're supposed to be Rich. Tim, you're supposed to be who you are. God used David's ability. What does a shepherd do every day when he's watching sheep? Well, he's flinging a sling around and he's probably knocking off branches off limbs or hitting birds or something, or maybe other shepherds across the pen or something, But he's doing what shepherds do. What did God do? God took a young man who was trusting in him and used those abilities to glorify himself. The same thing is true of you today. You've been given abilities. Dolores, you're given abilities to be a nurse. You used that ability to glorify God by what you did on the mission field. And your mission fields are wherever you walk in. So don't say, I can't do this. Do it the way that is you. Don't try to be anybody else. Don't try to be Saul. We don't want to be Saul. But, David didn't try to be Saul. David was David. That is what you're to do. Application 2. I bring you back around to the Shephelah. The Shephelah is the point at which the coastal plains met the mountains in that section. So this is where the Israelites would meet up with the likes of the Philistines. This is where culture meets. The people of God meeting the culture. The Shephelah in your life is wherever you work, wherever you lay. Wherever you lay. That doesn't seem right. Wherever you work, wherever you live. That's the word I was looking for. All right. Wherever you live. So basically the Shephelah is wherever you come in contact with the culture. Now you're called to influence that culture. Not like the Israelites did where they hightailed it up into the hills. You're to go down and you're to take possession of the Shephelah, your possession of the culture. And I mean, today it looks like an uphill battle, But the church is not called to pull back out of the culture. The church is called to be salt and light to the culture. So my challenge to you today is to, 1, use your God-given abilities to honor God the way He sees fit to use you. And 2, is during that use of those abilities, is that you're going into culture and you're taking back what little piece that you can, but you're still to be faithful to God into what He's delivered into your hands to do. You're not called to run back up into the mountains. You're called to go down into the culture and be a witness for who He is. I thank you very much. I have 1 minute left, so you can tell Miles that he can only bank a minute this week. Again, I thank you for listening to me. Have a good evening, and I dismiss you.